We have two great sayings in the UK. One of them is, "That wasn't a walk in the park." And the other is, "Well, that was no picnic." And I think you'll agree with me that they are pretty good descriptions of what the last 4 months have been like for us here in the UK, in our church and individually. Or perhaps I can offer you a different illustration. Back in March, we knew that there was a mess coming, and we were getting ready in all sorts of ways. And we managed to persuade ourselves that it's okay, we can get through this. And we did really well. We made a great start. But then March came and went. And then we find ourselves in April and, wow, things are not quite as good as they were, and it's tough and hard. By the time we get to May, things are beginning to unravel, and supplies in all sorts of ways, our energies, our lifestyle, our faith, everything is just taking a bit of a battering. That brings us to June, and we're now on really, really low reserves. But we're still confident we can get through this. And then, bang, July. And we find we're running on empty. Well, today's story that we read in the Bible is about the best picnic ever. But it's one that starts where Jesus and his disciples are actually running on empty. So it has something really important to say to us in terms of being open in all seasons. Let's have our reading.
The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countrysides and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he gave thanks, looking up to heaven, and broke the loaves. Then he gave it to them, to his disciples, to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000.
Thank you. I thought I would remain outside as we're thinking about this wonderful picnic gospel story. The 12 who'd been called by Jesus had probably been following him now for 2 to 3 years at the point we get to this story, and we know that because of where it falls in the gospel narrative. And the 12 were first called disciples, meaning someone who sits at the foot of a rabbi, a pupil, an apprentice. But then at chapter 6, the start of our chapter, they are called apostles, meaning sent ones. And I want us to get a sense of the longevity of the journey they have been travelling with Jesus. They had heard Jesus' amazing teachings. They had witnessed him have great opposition. They had seen him perform signs and wonders. And just before this story, we see that they have returned from the most stomach-curdling mission that they had been sent on without Jesus. They had been told to go without a bag or money, no belongings, to simply knock on doors and find people who would welcome them. Their mission was to share the kingdom of God and to perform those self-same signs and wonders. You can imagine the highs and lows of the drama of such a mission. And then they've returned to find that John the Baptist has been horrifically murdered. They were probably pretty much at the end of themselves, at the end of their reserves. And they needed rest. like us. They had not travelled that road before. All of it was unknown to them. So no wonder Jesus knew that they needed a rest, that they needed a quiet place to recover, that they needed to escape. They needed a holiday. Actually, they needed to get on a boat and go to a solitary place. Why don't we know that feeling? But unfortunately, that solitary place, their holiday destination, their great escape, was cancelled. And it's cancelled because a crowd of 5,000 men, plus women, plus children, all desperate to meet Jesus for themselves, got ahead of that solitary place to which they were going. They were like sheep without a shepherd. So the 12 apostles wanted to escape, but the 5,000 wanted to be found. They wanted freedom. And of course, Jesus had compassion on them because they were lost. And despite the apostles themselves being compassion fatigued, Jesus chooses to teach this humongous crowd. Well, of course, the 12 want to come to a solution to this. They want to get rid of these people. So they come up with a plan. But unfortunately, it was a plan that backfired. You see, they go up to Jesus and they say, oh, Jesus, look, Jesus, this is a remote place and these people are tired and hungry. I tell you what, why don't you just send them now to the countryside, to the villages, to go and get food? Well, as I said, it backfired because Jesus turns around and goes, you feed them. That is the most ridiculous, impossible thing for Jesus to have said. And sometimes we can feel that too. When we are compassion fatigued at the end of ourselves, when, if you like, our basket is empty and we have nothing to give, we can't feed others, Jesus still says the same. So they ask around and they manage to find just 5 loaves and 2 fish. That would be the equivalent. And we know in other gospel stories that's actually a boy's lunch. But Jesus takes what is given and he blesses it. And here's the thing. The miracle happens at the hands of the apostles, the sent ones. And that is the same for us. And I don't doubt for a minute that the apostles were rather grumpy at this stage, giving out this food. But then imagine what was happening for them as the miracle is happening at their hands. And of course we know at the end that the basket was full to overflowing. There were 12 baskets that were full. They had plenty. There was more than enough. Actually, the 5 loaves and 2 small fish just went on forever. 12 baskets full. Full. That was the glorious miracle. Well, we can crack and fall too, can't we? So this last week in our SLT meeting, I felt really overwhelmed, and not for the first time. I cracked and I shared my frustration. I had tears. But that's okay. That doesn't mean I'm weak, and I was not treated as weak. It means I'm human. And it means actually I'm totally dependent upon God. And the good news for you guys is you need a vicar who is dependent on God. And that's what you've got. I cracked. I had tears. But the thing is, whatever we are feeling and wherever we are at, the call remains the same. We are both disciples and apostles. Well, I've just had a staycation at home. And during my staycation, I chose to watch with Mark, my husband, 2 films. And the first one was, they're both true stories, and they both have people of faith, and they were on the main TV. So the first film was a film called Marvellous, and it's a true story of a guy called Neil Baldwin. Now, this chap has learning difficulties. He has special needs, and yes, he follows Jesus. But there's this lovely phrase in the film that when he would meet someone, even if he just met you briefly for 2 minutes, in his mind, you were a good friend of his. And you see that as you go through the film. He would talk about people he'd met. Oh, they're a good friend of mine. just that attitude of openness and welcome. He just met you once, just briefly, you were a good friend of his. And the thing is, he didn't mind making a fool of himself or putting himself in situations even to be mocked. And Neil has this attitude. He's still alive now. He's had this attitude all his life and still does, that nothing is impossible. And as a result, he met and managed to get a number of really famous people to do things for him and for him to do things with them. He played for Stoke City in a testimonial match. It's a great film. You can still get it on iPlayer. It's on until the BBC iPlayer. It's on until July the 31st. I recommend it because Neil is an example. For me, he's like the boy who just brought the 2 loaves and 5 fish. That's what I've got. I know you might think that's impossible to feed 5,000, but Jesus, you think it's possible, so here's my lunch. Neil inspires me as a person to step out in faith. The other film that I watched was the film called Harriet. And Harriet is, or was, just a most beautiful, courageous black African woman in the States. And she was born into slavery in either 1819 or 1822 in Maryland. And she was born into slavery but wanted her children to be born free. Now, this woman was incredibly prophetic. She had God speak to her in dreams. She would hear God speak to her, show her what to do. It's just an amazing story. Do please watch the film. And she grew in her ability to hear God. She was a woman of prayer. Now, what happened is, because she wanted to have her children born free but wouldn't be set free by her owner, she freed herself miraculously in 1851 using a system called the Underground Railroad. It was incredibly risky and she travelled this dangerous journey of 100 miles. When she got to Pennsylvania, she lived free for a whole year. But her heart was troubled. How could she live free when her family, when her friends, when others were still in slavery? So what we see in this film is this immensely courageous lady who doesn't choose to keep her freedom, instead risks it and goes back to rescue other slaves, to free them. And when you see the first time she goes back, the ones she wanted to save actually wouldn't go with her, but others did. And this is a really important bit in the film where the people, the slave owners were after her and the slaves who had escaped, and there's just one bridge that they can get across and they are waiting. And God tells her to stop. She must not go that way. So she says, no, we must turn left. And she goes downriver, and they are now faced with the only escape route to cross a river. And the slaves with her don't want to go, but she prays. And she says, Lord, make a way. And I'm not spoiling the film. There's so much in it, you still need to watch this. But what happens is she walks across this water. It's amazing. She walks across the water and the people see that she can take them to freedom. And that's what she did. And she went back and forth many, many times. She just rescued so many slaves. She became part of a group that did that. She rescued over 700 slaves rather. And she led soldiers in an army. It's just an amazing thing. But this woman, her name as the rescuer was Moses. That's what she was known as. It's a beautiful story. But she didn't want to just look after her own freedom. She had a heart for those who needed to be free. A good few years back, when we had a previous associate vicar, we had an elderly member of our congregation who wrote a poem once about John, Phil and I. And the poem began each with different verses. And the poem, for John's line, it was, John is like Nehemiah. Then it would go on to Phil. Then it would go on to me. Elaine is like Moses. And then it would go on to Phil. Phil is like Jesus. It was a lovely, sweet poem that he wrote for us. Well, after my tears on Monday, I prayed. And then I had a good word with myself. And thinking of Harriet being called Moses, I said to myself, I'm Harriet. I'm Harriet. You see, Jesus had the power for the miracle, but it was performed at the hands of the apostles. Jesus had the power to free those slaves, but it was done through Harriet giving of herself and bringing them home. The miracles happened at her hands, at her prayers. For Neil, his impossible life has been made possible because of his faith in Jesus, but also because he stepped out and he took risks. He did what he had. Well, following this story, following this miracle, Jesus then does send the disciples away back on the boat. And what happens is at night and a storm blows up, and Jesus then walks on the water towards them and stills the storm. And then we read this. Then he came closer and climbed into the boat with them, and immediately the stormy wind became still. They were completely and utterly overwhelmed with astonishment, because they had failed to learn the lesson of the miracle of the loaves, and their hearts were unwilling to learn the lesson. That's really challenging. They've had this fantastic experience, but that's so challenging, isn't it? I want to say to us, we are not in a time of survival. We are in a season of growth. Yes, it's a special time, and we all have special needs. Will the lost who we have just met be our good friends? Will we, having been set free, return to free those who are still in bondage? Will we be open to the lessons we have learnt, are in the midst of learning and still need to learn? Are our hearts still open? Do we have open hearts, whatever the weather? Jesus didn't say it's a walk in the park. Jesus didn't say it's going to be a picnic. But he did say, will you follow me? And I will be with you. He said, I am the picnic. I am the bread of life. Taste and see that I am good, and invite others to come and join the banquet. So I stand before you today and say that whatever the weather, whether I'm empty or full, I am Harriet. I am Moses. I am Elaine. I am because the I am, Jesus, is Lord. What will you say?